kind of initial section, I'm going to invite Mark Ayer over from 451 Research, S&P Global. And Mark's got some super interesting information to show us all. And then he and I will have a little back and forth on that. Let me move over, Mark, and give you the. Yeah, I think maybe I'll sit right over here. Cool. Hi, everybody. First of all, let me start by saying thanks to Splunk and Cisco and AWS for inviting me to come over here today. It's always fun. Mind if I take one of the clicker? Yeah. I can't be trusted with. Well, that's obvious. A quick thing on my background. So I'm a principal security analyst at 451 Research. And I always joke this is the longest company name in the history, which is S&P Global Market Intelligence, which owns us, and 451 Research is the company underneath it. Anyway, I've been in this business for 38 years. So along with Paul, I'm a member of the Old Guys Club. And within that 40 years, 20 of it's been in security. And so throughout my career in security, I think one of the underlying currents has always been kind of, for me anyway, has been the democratization of data, right? That's the barrier for a lot of folks in making security work, or really kind of any application, right? So that's kind of where I've come from. Today, what I do is I cover security, obviously, security operations. So that's, SIM, XDR, all those sorts of things, as well as cloud security, so CNAP and all those aspects. So I've got a little bit of history around this topic. So even though I'm an analyst today, which means I'm basically a kind of a writer, right? I was a techie to start with. I was a developer for 10 years. And then I got into marketing and other stuff. Found my way into Big Fix, which then got me into IBM. And shortly after that, I made my way into the QRadar product management group, where I worked with Jason Kierstead and others. And one of the first things that we ran into with QRadar was that, and this continues today, most folks don't have one SIM or one analytics product, right? They have on average 2, sometimes 3, some even 4, right? And that's for a variety of reasons, One of which was, back then, this would have been around 2010, Splunk was our number one competitor. Here I'm sitting next to Mike. Splunk was our number one competitor, but also, it was there at that time for a different reason. And a lot of people brought Splunk in for IT operations, for compliance, that sort of thing. And QRadar, of course, was kind of a pure play security analytics tool. And we both kind of needed to share data. And at that point, it was hard. And even harder was when we had to get data from like ArcSight and others, because they were all different kind of, obvious. Everybody in this room is drunk that Kool-Aid, right? But anyway, so yeah, I remember, talking with Jason and other folks right about then, and this would have been, again, 2010 to 2014 was when I was a product manager over there. And say, well, wouldn't it be great if we just had some way where we could all interoperate and, and play on a level playing field. Now, I can't take credit for anything else beyond that as far as OCSF, because Jason and everybody took it from there. But I just do remember the pain that we went through just trying to do those integrations back in the day. Okay. Yeah, and then of course in 2022 when OCSF finally became a thing, I was just, yes, it's about time, I can't believe it took so long, but yeah, it's great. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're kind of seeing, from my perspective as an analyst. One of the great things about my job is I have access to this incredible wealth of data. We run these surveys, we call them Voice of the Enterprise, and we survey usually 500 to 600 security practitioners, primarily North America, but also some international, primarily mid-sized companies, say 100 million and up. But also there's a component of the small businesses in there too. And because we've done this for a decade, I can get into these surveys and I can look at trends, right? And this is one of the ones that really was eye-opening to me. And that is, it's just a simple question. You can see at the top there. It said, how many security analytics alerts are you unable to investigate in a single day? And it was bad enough in 2020, right? It was around a third. As you can see, the trend line was just not going in the right direction, right? So 2023, it finally went over half to 54%. So think about that for a second. It's over half of the alerts people just couldn't get to. And I'll talk about my thoughts on why that was the case. And then last year it did drop, right? Dropped to 43%. And the only thing that's kind of frustrating is we don't know exactly why. Right? I mean, I can theorize, well, maybe it's some early gains from AI, right? Some people are helping to using AI to decrease the dwell time, the investigation time. But I think part of that has to do with just increased federation, right? Again, the democratization of data, which of course OCSF is a huge part of. But we're not out of the woods yet, because of that population, 20%, 19% were unable to investigate over 3/4 of their alerts. So that's still a huge problem, but it does look like it's starting to move in the right direction. We'll see next year how that turns out. This one's kind of fun. So this is another question that we ask. And basically we go to the SOC teams and we say, what are the most important tools to you? And over the years, it's sort of varied. A lot of times SIM was number one, but the last couple of years, it's been trending to that top one, which is security integration transformation tools. Wow, what a surprise, right? So, it's obvious that the teams are still struggling with this, but they also value the ability to, easily get data in between their tools, because again, they're dealing with this incredible complexity of between all the SIMs and all the other products, and they all just need to get it in one place. Now, within that, I've been really encouraged to see some of the movements. Again, Splunk has really jumped onto the federation bandwagon, obviously with OCSF and other mechanisms. I know we got some folks from Comcast in the room. DataB is a super cool product. I'm fascinated with that. The whole idea of a security data fabric is just awesome, right? Just being able to not only create data lakes of data, that's been pre-normalized, if you will, but also to be able to provide data access to that, regardless of whether it's in a data lake or if you want to go directly to the source without having to move it, right? But have one kind of data plane to do that, I think it's really, really cool. And despite the fact that some people still say that the SIM is dead, it's number 2, according to the people that we survey.
Everybody wants to be a SIM.
Yeah. Well, what I think has happened, though, Paul, is that the definition of SIM's changing.
Yes.
Right? So they might call it a data analytics platform or, whatever it might be, but it's still a SIM at the end of the day, right?
So, yeah, interestingly, we heard Rod and I were at an AWS event the other night, and we heard AI being described as to how the SOC can be transformed. And even though I think it was somebody from Anthropic, it was public, so I could saying, our SOC is driven by AI, but we have a SIM. And I said, who maintains the data collection and all that? AI, agentic. We'll see some things today in our presentations after this talk, but I think it's all coming together around that data centralization and federation both. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you see the AI movement with the SOC from the standpoint of reducing that number to hopefully single digits.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm so, it's so funny. Every year there's some kind of buzzword at RSA, right? Of course, this year it's agentic. And at dinner last night we were talking. I said, if we turned agentic AI into a drinking game, we'd all be dead right now, right? But that said, obviously there are some gains already being seen. I've been to Google's events and Microsoft's events and and Splunk and all the other various folks. But what I'm seeing in the field is folks are beginning to adopt AI. And obviously, one of the things that AI requires in order to work is data, right? And if the AI can't get to the data, then you're not going to get a lot of value back out of it, or it's going to be wrong, which is even worse, right? And so, I think we're still early days, obviously. What I see in the field is most people that are using AI today, it's the assistants, the co-pilots, whatever you want to call them, right? Which is really useful, if you look at just even some of the basic routine tasks that the SOC analyst has to go through, especially these poor level 1 people, right, who really, in the past, they would be tasked with staring at event screens, right? Just scrolling by, looking for things or whatever. And so now we can eliminate a lot of that kind of routine analysis. And then we're, kind of driving up into even more advanced use cases like script analysis, right? Being able to detect malware in scripts and things sort of in real time without having to spend 2 hours doing it, right? So I think that's really what's driving some of those reductions.
By the way, OCSF introduced script objects for that very purpose. Some of these scripts are unbelievably large, like endpoint products can submit them. And I was shocked when some of the folks at Cisco Endpoint said, wait a minute, we may need many megabytes of size to represent those scripts that somebody needs to analyze.
Yeah.
That's a perfect example of where potentially an AI bot or agentic node could play.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so any of those repetitive tasks, that it doesn't matter if you have 100 SOC analysts, they couldn't get to them all, right? Which speaks to what we see there. Yeah, and so to whatever extent we can automate a lot of that routine stuff, and then we're kind of progressing from there into the so-called agentic. What I think is funny is people think agentic is like the latest and greatest thing, but agentic was defined 40 years ago, right? Of course, it wasn't really security back then. It's more robotic process automation, that sort of stuff. But this is not new stuff, but for us it is, right? And I'm kind of skeptical too. I mean, most of the vendors that are publishing agents, even like Google's just got a handful of them so far, which is not a bad thing, right? Because I think with the power of these agents, right? Because of what an agent can do is it can not only take inputs, but it can also take actions. And so as soon as you've got an agent or whatever you want to call it there that can start to do things, that's good. But if someone were to take that over, and use it for nefarious means, and then spawn 10,000 of them at the same time, that's not good, right? So security of those agents is huge, right? So we need to have some sort of provenance, the equivalent of a certificate, all that sort of thing to make sure that people can't take them over. Right, so another thing we're seeing, and this also seems very familiar to me, is the whole platformization concept. And what I mean by that is that folks are looking for a platform based on what we call a center of gravity. So these are examples of centers of gravity. At the top, you've got security operations, SIM, or whatever you want to call it these days. Identity, you've got network access, like Secure Access Service Edge or SASE. Exposure and risk management, and then cloud native, so CNAPS and all those sort of things. So regardless of which platform an organization finally chooses, they're going to choose one. And our studies show that about 88% of the organizations that we surveyed are or have already picked one of these platforms, which isn't too surprising, right? I mean, how many customers does Splunk have, for example, right? And that's a natural, or whatever it might be. But what was even more interesting to me, because I came back from the IBM days when Tivoli was a platform. How many of you were around during Tivoli? This is the old G Club right here. Tivoli was in its day was kind of state of the art, but the objective was to lock people in, right? You couldn't integrate with anything if it wasn't another Tivoli product, right? And so there are still folks that have some bad juju from those days. They said, I want a platform, but I don't want to get locked in. And so what we're finding in our studies is that even though 88% of the folks may have picked or have picked a platform or are going to, they're only spending about a third, that 36% of their security budget on that vendor, the primary platform vendor. So what does that mean? So that means the other 2/3 is going somewhere else. And if it's going somewhere else, guess what? It's going to have to integrate, right? And those are large enterprises. If you go down market, like to the middle and small companies, it's 40%. All right, so integration is just huge. Probably preaching to the choir here, but it's true. All right, so speaking of, I found this graphic and kind of reminded me of 2001 a little bit. But yeah, so what I'm seeing, I've kind of already talked about this, but AI models, you've got training and you got inference, right? Training, absolutely, you've got to be able to get to whatever data, as much data as you can, right? So theoretically, the more data you get to, the better the model and so on. And also for, things like RAG, the grounding and so on, true, you also need data for that. And again, if you can't get to it, then you can't make use of it. So the common security vocabulary of OCSF, especially for security use cases with AI, is just absolutely, tantamount. It's almost a requirement, which I'm sure speaks to part of the reason why there's 1,000 companies or whatever it is using it today. Right? Data standardization also includes explainability, right? So in AI, once it reaches the conclusion, I think there's always going to be a human in the loop. I don't care how many times people say that things are going to be, you're going to have an autonomous SOC. I don't believe it, right?
We're waiting for the day that we have AI analysts.
Right. Yeah. Well, I kind of think of it coming back around to agentic, right? I can think of the old analogy. Remember, like during the nuclear silos, and you always had to have 2 keys, right, before you could do something. And and at the time it was 2 military officers, and they were in separate rooms or whatever. Well, if one of those keys is an agent, that other key better well be a human, right? Especially if it's a high risk type of action it's about to take. I could see where automation of routine tasks, like a perfect use case of that would be, we've seen somebody logging in from an unusual location combined with a couple other indicators that says, well, this is probably not the person we think it is. And so the natural thing is to force a password reset or an MFA challenge, whatever it might be. Yeah, so those kinds of things, those are low risk. They affect like one user, unless it's the CEO. Maybe you might want to have someone else look at that first. But other than that, that's a perfect thing that you could have an automated action, without a human in the loop. But
I'm just wondering whether, that rise that you saw in the number of unaddressed alerts has to do with some analytic techniques. For example, the anomaly detection and, the user behavioral analytics and machine learning based detections versus rules, my experiences created a lot of, I won't say noise, but potentially false positives. I'm wondering whether the either evolution of that analytic capability or maybe the falling out of favor had something to do with the drop. I'm just speculating on why it increased as more and more people were adopting machine learning-based techniques versus rule-based techniques. And then we realized that, my gosh, all these anomalies are showing up, many of which are not really actionable. Maybe somebody just tamped down that we don't know. Well, but I will say, pitch for OCSF, and where Josh mentioned it, we've introduced baselines and much more support for machine learning and anomaly detection. It is still a very important technique.
Yeah, and you make a really good point, Paul, which is when a lot of time nowadays when somebody says AI, everybody immediately goes to Gen AI, right? But behind that, in history, machine learning techniques have been with us for a decade or more, right? And those, for me, that's the foundation of how we're going to be able to get past these static rules-based architectures. And, because with ML, you could do things like look at behavior, baselining behavior, looking for anomalies, and they can be multiple points that you're looking for. And then you combine that with the reasoning capability of Gen AI. Now, all of a sudden, you've got something cool. But unless you're really got the underlying ML kind of nailed, right, Gen AI is not going to be useful at all, right? But it does do a good job of the two of those things can do a really good job of kind of detecting things. And what really excites me is the concept of being able to automatically investigate things. Once we'll say the ML says, it looks like we've got a problem here, and then Gen AI could step in and start pulling in all sorts of different things and relating those together. So the combination of those two.
And when SOARs came about, that's a lot of what people were doing. We were talking last night a little bit about what SOARs could do versus how people used SOARs.
Yeah.
When I first saw Phantom Cyber, for example, from some of our friends from the past that came out of stealth, I'm like, nobody's going to use this to change firewall rules, and nobody's going to wipe a system because of a virus or something automatically. He said, I know, we do that so people can, imagine. But reality, most of the time what they're doing is speeding up routine investigations.
Yeah.
And there's no question that can be improved with AI and Gen AI, and just summarization of the things that an analyst would have to read through itself is, maybe it doesn't sound super exciting, but reality is that could save many hours a day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's part of the promise of agentic as well. If you think back to, the early SOAR days, it was a cool idea, but just like the static rules in a sim, the Lowe's playbooks were by and large are static as well. And so the ability then, and we've got all these playbooks, every organization may have thousands of them, and it's got a lot of good stuff in there, but if they're rigid and static, then you can't really build it into an automation. But the automation could modify playbooks, sort of on the fly, so make them much more dynamic. And so I think we're going to see that happening too, which is going to be cool.
I agree. I think it's kind of, there's that initial excitement of what you could do, and then over time with experience, it's like what you will do.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to then damp out over the next few years, but got to keep our eye on it.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other thing too, now that you mentioned it, is sort of this closed loop notion of an AI too, where if it picks something wrong, and assuming there's still a human in the loop, and the human goes, no, that was bad. AI bad, not good. And the AI learns, right? And then the next time through, and then it'll make the right decision. And so this whole closed loop thing will continually improve what these AIs can do. So, yeah. And then, and the other thing about agentic, which I find kind of fascinating, is the agent-to-agent concept, right? Where, so you can have all these specialized agents and they're doing their thing, but, I think going forward, there's going to be the requirement, there already is obviously, because we have the A2A protocol, which just came out, to communicate with each other, right? And so for that to happen, they're going to need to be able to have fast access not only to other agents, but to their data, all right? So for all this to happen together. So again, that brings us right back to an open standard for all that kind of thing.
Yeah, what's that's called model context protocol? Is that?
Yeah, MCP.
Yeah. I think, Jason, did you not write up a nice little article on MCP recently? Give him a plug there. Yeah, everybody should go search on that, learn a little bit more about it. I think we're going to hear more about that.
Yeah. Yeah, the stuff that Jason and his company at Symbian are doing, it's really, really cool stuff, too. Well, plug for Jason there. All right. I think that's pretty much...
Thank you.
There's my contact information. Feel free if you want to reach out. If you guys would like these charts or whatever, let me know. I can...
We've got a little short time for any Q&A. I wanted to ask my first question, but please, if you have any questions, we can probably handle one or two. And this was a mundane question, but with all the surveys you're doing, on average, how many data sources does a typical SOC deal with?
Well, that depends on largely on the size of the organization, right? Like a large enterprise, like one of the things that I brought out of my QRadar years was being able to actually work in the SOC, with a lot of these folks and helping them with the integrations and things. And, you take a big company like Disney or whatever, and they've got thousands, literally thousands, maybe tens of thousands if you look at it.
And how many of those do you think are in the same format?
Very few. Right. Yeah.
Any questions in the audience for Mark? Okay, that's all right. Very good.
Oh, we got to go.
Yeah, Julia. Haven't seen you in a while.
I know I've been delinquent. In terms of adoption of open schemas, I know ECS is another big one, and I know they're kind of in the middle ground of merging with the semantic convention from open telemetry. Do you see much uptake between OCSF and that?
I'm not all that familiar, to be honest with you, with things outside of OCSF. I think in general, that is the way the industry is moving, because folks just understand that it's possible. That also reminds me, though, even for the vendors that don't or haven't adopted OCSF, one of these might be like Google, as an example. We have any Googlers here?
One forward out.
Yeah, they're downstairs right now. I understand it. They're Google. They've got their own schemas and all their technologies tied to it. But even they have done some extensions and whatnot so that they can interface with OCSF, right? So I think even the folks that haven't adopted are forced, and maybe not being forced, but are semi-voluntarily starting to adopt it to some level.
Yeah, one quick point on that, Julian. We have talked with both the Elastic folks and the OTel folks. Splunk is a big supporter of OTel. We've actually one of the big contributors. There was an effort to do a mapping between ECS and OCSF. I think what distinguishes us, and I don't want to say anything negative about ECS, it's really great. It was not open early when we were first evaluating what kind of schemas to use, Rod and I and others. It was, they, in my opinion, maybe they realized it needed to be open. But we'd already started OCSF. We'd gone a little bit too far to go back. But we have been working with the Semantic Conventions group informally, and there is still an initiative to, for example, we have a proposal, it hasn't been accepted, to use OTel's protocols and bindings to communicate security information in OCSF form over OTel protocols. We've got a protobuf encoding that we did mainly for the reason of starting to be compatible with those protocols. So stay tuned and stay involved. Julian was one of the early contributors. I have to credit him. A lot of what you see there is partly Julian's work. So we're not giving up on that.
Yeah. One more question, kind of building on top of that question, was OTel is very complex, but it has decent adoption, in the observability space, right?
Exactly.
And so the relationship between what OCSF is doing and OTel, I think it'll be helpful to kind of articulate that they're not competing and they're sort of building one on top of the other. That's just
yeah, and that's how we look at it. We don't see it as competitive. I will say ECS threw a little bit of a wrinkle into things because until ECS was donated to OTel, the semantic conventions were being done kind of in an ad hoc manner. I haven't followed. I don't know how much the ECS schema has been actually adopted into the semantic conventions. That I need to go find out. But one important point is that we have made some linkages due to one of our very active customers that's building a data lake that's combining OTel data and OCSF data in one data lake. So we did introduce, I think in 1.4, Rajas, traces and metrics objects. We didn't want to redefine what they've done, but like we do with MITRE, we refer to what's been done elsewhere so that there's an intersection for that data. So we're not where we'd like to be yet, but it's a great question from both of you. We're still hoping to work closer together. Now we're all Linux Foundation projects, by the way.
Oh yeah, I was going to mention that too. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a question regarding international adoption. Do you see, is it like balanced or unbalanced? Do you see more the Western countries looking at OCSF? Because I deal a lot with the ITU with China, Japan, Korea, and many other parts of the world. So it's important for me to see do we need to push more for some countries or not? Because I could help, but I just have no idea how this is.
I don't know, Paul, do you have any? I don't have any idea, actually, to be honest.
I will say, and again, full disclosure, Arno and I have worked together for many years. The predecessor to work that became OCSF and it was generously granted by Symantec Broadcom was something we called ICDX, and it was called the Integrated Cyber Defense Schema. That was a framework that we worked on, in the Symantec days. And in those days, I do recall talking to many of our international customers that were looking for a schema normalization and standardization, which is why and again, I mentioned Arno's role now with the ITU, why we suggested that we donate the ICD schema to the ITU, which we did, actually. That was ahead of OCSF.